We now continue our discussion of the book of Leviticus. A few comments on Leviticus 8 through 10. This describes the ordination of Aaron and the priests. And the priesthood were there to perform sacrifice and rituals. Leviticus 9. They mediated between God and man. They conveyed the Lord's blessings. They taught Israel the law. Now the priests had to be holy in behavior, and there's kind of a tell that underscores that, the tell of Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's two sons, who came before the Lord and offered up strange fire, or perhaps could be translated unauthorized incense, and they were struck dead. They may well have been drunk, according to, in describing the need for holiness after the event. Aaron is told that you, along with your sons, must not drink wine or intoxicating drink, which suggests that perhaps his sons were drunk at the time they came to offer the sacrifice. Later on, Leviticus emphasizes details on the holiness of priests in Leviticus 21 and 22. One can compare James chapter 3, that not many should presume to become teachers in the church. Not many are called to this kind of leadership role, but those that do should take special care that they be holy in their behavior. There you can see the verse in James. The impurity system. I have a separate reading that I'm going to have you look at on this, but I'll deal with it in brief in Leviticus 11 through 15. There are different ways that a person could become ceremonially unclean, either by eating taboo foods that were prohibited. Leviticus 11 talks about that. Or various types of bodily discharges, ejaculation for men, menstruation or childbirth for women made you ceremonially unclean. Skin diseases made you ceremonially unclean. Certain mildews made you ceremonially unclean. The passage about the leper in Leviticus 13 and 14 deal with that. And touching the dead, either animal or human, could make you ceremonially unclean. Well, what were you to do when you became ceremonially unclean? Well, you had to avoid that which was holy, which meant that you could not approach God in the tabernacle. And you should take steps to become ceremonially or ritually clean again. Now, that varied on what kind of uncleanness you had contracted. In some cases, all you had to do was wait for a certain period of time after touching a carcass of an otherwise clean animal that had died of itself, or you were unclean till evening. Others involved elaborate ritual. It might involve bathing, as Leviticus 22:6 describes, or a priestly ritual, as in the cleansing of the leper in Leviticus 14. Numbers 19 describes a ritual involving the ashes of a red heifer to be sprinkled on one who was contaminated by touching a human corpse. Well, what are the lessons, or what lesson are these laws of purity trying to teach? And I argue in that article that I'll have you read that the main purpose of these laws was to teach an object lesson that God is holy and man is contaminated. While being unclean is not necessarily to be sinful, there's at least an analogy between sin and uncleanness. Everyone became unclean from time to time because it was just part of living in this sin-cursed world. Women can't avoid their periods. Ejaculation for men made them ceremonially unclean. But nonetheless, it made you unclean, and it's a reminder that in comparison with the holy God, we are contaminated. We're sinful. And I believe this is probably the main lesson of these laws. Other minor lessons It separated worship from the realm of the dead. It discouraged worshiping the dead, necromancy, consulting the dead and spiritualism, offering sacrifices to the dead, as Egyptians often did, and there's some evidence in Canaan that it happened there too. It separated worship from any expression of sexuality. For example, in ancient Greece, if you went to worship the goddess of love, Aphrodite, you might well visit the brothel next door where the prostitutes function as priestesses of Aphrodite, so you would worship the goddess of love by doing a sex act. Likewise, in Mesopotamia, according to Herodotus anyway, sometimes women were obligated to prostitute themselves at a temple. But this was prohibited of the Israelites. They were not to engage in any kind of sexual activity in conjunction with worship. The purity laws also served to separate Israelites from Gentiles. The food laws would limit table fellowship with non-Israelites because Israelites were not to eat things like pork, and Gentiles would. And even to this day, food laws help Jewish people remain distinctive from Gentiles in Judaism. Now, at best, a secondary explanation is hygiene. Lepers were removed from people by quarantining them, and thus would keep their disease separated from the general population. And there's some evidence that prohibited foods like pork might play a role in transmitting disease, but I don't believe that hygiene is a primary reason. It seems inconceivable that Christ would have abolished the food laws, which he does in Mark chapter 7, verses 14 through 19, where he declared all foods clean. It's inconceivable that he would have done that if hygiene were the main purpose. Rather, the main purpose is symbolic, to symbolize the holiness of God and sinfulness of people, separation of worship from sexuality, separation of worship from the dead, separation of Israelites from non-Israelites and the like. Well, let me move on to Leviticus 16 through 27. Where we will emphasize the Day of Atonement and the Holiness Code. The Day of Atonement, described in Leviticus 16, also known as Yom Kippur in Jewish circles. On the Day of the Atonement was the most sacred day in all Judaism. It occurred once a year on the 10th of Tishri, which would be September, October in our calendars. And it was the only time in which the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies. And in order to do so, he had to atone first of all for himself, but then he would conduct a ritual involving 2 goats. Now, the traditional rendering of the goat that goes out in the desert, there was 2 goats. One would be sacrificed and brought before the altar, and his blood sprinkled on the Ark of the Covenant. The other goat was driven out into the desert, and there's some debate as to how to render the term for that second goat. The traditional rendering is scapegoat. The Hebrew word is azazel. Azazel, if it means scapegoat, is from 2 words. It is from az, goat, and azel, to go, and would thus mean the goat that goes, the goat that goes away. And this is a view as old as the Greek translation, the Septuagint. The alternative view is that Azazel is the name of a demon, perhaps a goat demon. So the English Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version, and it will render it in verse 8 that there are 2 goats, one for the Lord, that's the one that sacrificed, and the one for Azazel. But sending a goat to Azazel means sending it to the place associated with Azazel, that is the hideous desert. However, no demon known by that name is known from the ancient Near East, and I personally think the traditional view is probably more likely. The symbolism on the Day of Atonement is you have two goats. The first one is slaughtered as a sin offering, and that symbolizes sin forgiven, sin atoned for. The second goat, the scapegoat, or the goat for Azazel, they would lay their hands on, the priest would lay his hands over that goat and symbolically transfer all the sin and uncleanness of the people onto that goat and then drive it out into the desert. And that would symbolize sin removed, sin forgotten. The first goat, sin forgiven. The second goat, sin forgotten. Completely removed from the sanctuary and no longer a problem. The New Testament sees Christ as our Day of Atonement sacrifice. The Day of Atonement, according to Hebrews 7 and chapters 9 and 10, is a type of the atoning work of Christ on the cross. Though in every way Christ's sacrifice is superior. Christ as priest was sinless and needed no sacrifice for himself, whereas Aaron was sinful and had to offer a sacrifice for himself before he could enter the sanctuary to offer the sacrifice for the people. Christ's sacrifice needed only to be offered up once, whereas Aaron's sacrifice had to be offered up annually, each year, year by year by year. And Christ entered heaven itself to do his priestly work, as opposed to Aaron, who entered the earthly sanctuary, which is a copy of the heavenly one.